We're going to talk about the Jesuit martyrs today and what they can teach us in terms of work for overcoming injustice in our world today, now. And this is a really challenging topic for me. It's challenging because we don't have a ton of time. And sometimes when I give talks around the lives of the martyrs, people say, well, how long do you want to talk? I'm like, don't ask me that because I'll go on forever. But what I hope I can do today is share a little bit of the story of the martyrs, why they are martyrs, what happened to them, what was the context around that, and then talk about some ways that at the Ignatian Solidarity Network we are responding to their legacy, and talk a bit about some ways that you all might become involved in that, or think about how their story can inspire you to be more deeply engaged in working for justice in your own lives. So over the course of the presentation, I'll share some images and some things that I learned from a recent trip to El Salvador. Last July, we took 45 people from across the country, people who have been working at Jesuit institutions, people who graduated from Jesuit institutions, to learn about the lives of the martyrs, and to do it in El Salvador in the context of the 25th anniversary. So the Jesuits were killed, and the two lay women were killed in 1989. That's 25 years ago. And while 25 years seems like a long time, there's still great things that can be learned about what happened. One of the people we met with, who maybe you're familiar with, is a Jesuit named John Sobrino. John was living at the Jesuit University in San Salvador in 1989 when his brother Jesuits in Salina and Elba were murdered, but he wasn't there the night of the murders. He was in Asia at a meeting, and he learned of their deaths the next morning when he received a phone call. So he has this really interesting, kind of unique, reality in the sense that he would have been killed. Everyone in that residence that night in 1989 was killed, and he wasn't. But so he's often asked to talk about his fellow Jesuits and what their lives, what their legacy means. And he consistently, you'll hear John say something around this phrasing, this idea of what have you done, what are you doing, what will you do for the poor. Sometimes he'll talk about the poor of El Salvador. Sometimes he'll talk about people marginalized by other injustices, but using kind of the idea of poor as someone who's marginalized by injustice. And he always says this is what the Jesuits were committed to when they came to El Salvador. The interesting thing about the Jesuit martyrs is that their legacy or their commitment to the people of El Salvador didn't just start in 1989. They had come there in the late 60s when there was and founded a Jesuit university. And this was a very challenging thing to do because the situation in El Salvador is becoming much more tumultuous and dangerous. You may know that in 1980, Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, was murdered. The anniversary was just last month, 35th anniversary. There were also 4 U.S. churchwomen, 3 nuns and 1 laywoman who were murdered that year. A Jesuit priest named Retiro Grande was killed in 1977. And over the course of about a 10 to 12-year civil war in El Salvador, over 70,000 innocent civilians were killed. This is a small country, so 70,000 is a significant number. So the loss of the martyrs was just part of this history, but their commitment to the poor of El Salvador had begun much before that, as they developed what is called the UCA, the University of Central America, the Jesuit University, as they connected and became really in relationship with the people of El Salvador. Each one of the Jesuits was not just working at the university, but connected to a rural community. And so when we were in El Salvador, we had the chance to visit a number of rural communities where the Jesuits had come to know people. They would go out and celebrate Mass and other sacraments, work with them on different injustice and other issues that the communities were facing. So these were men that over that time had become very committed to the people of El Salvador. What I'd like to do is to share a brief video with you. It's just a few minutes, and it actually is the trailer from a documentary called Blood in the Backyard. It is the story of the Jesuits when they were killed in El Salvador in 1989. This is just 3 minutes. It gives you a little bit of imagery and sound to go with this story. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can pull this off here. I'm gonna load.
Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself.
In El Salvador, one of the most brutal and violent days in 10 years of war. While rebels and government troops continued fighting for control of the capital city of San Salvador, a group of armed men entered a university there and brutally murdered 8 people, including 6 Jesuit priests.
Extreme right-wing politicians and sectors of the armed forces have for a long time considered the Jesuits to be the intellectual authors of the leftist insurgency here.
Faith takes courage, faith takes energy, it takes passion, it takes commitment. That's what they represented, and ultimately they paid the price.
In the midst of so much horror, there have been good people.
Sus vidas son ejemplo de entrega, ejemplo de servicio a los demás, ejemplo de búsqueda de la justicia.
La pregunta debe ser, ¿quién resuelve más humanamente los problemas de las mayorías populares? No quién da más libertades formales a las minorías elitistas.
I was awakened by the suffering of the Jesuits, of the innocent people. I realized that there were thousands, millions of people on crosses. And we had to take them down from their crosses. It does still animate us to continue to do what we know must be done so that peace can happen and be what we call the kingdom of God.
La carne es sola y un rato, no creas que soy guayón. Son pellejos para los gatos que empezaban de pilón. Uno tira.
Nos logramos poner de acuerdo y logramos tener líneas, grandes líneas, que nos permitieran saber hacia dónde más o menos podíamos ir.
La vida de nuestros hermanos jesuitas nos hace sentir que vale la pena trabajar por un mundo distinto, por un mundo más justo.
Está primero las necesidades básicas del 80 al 90% de la población y luego está la libertad de expresión, la libertad de otras cosas que son muy importantes también.
Creo yo de que esa sangre no debe de quedar derramada simplemente y recordarla, sino que esa sangre sea inspiración para nosotros para continuar. Ese es el gran deber que tenemos en nuestro país y creo que en todos los países del mundo.
I wish, before I die, to watch this shamelessness disappear. I wish to see goodness, which is present in the planet, grows more and more and more.
That was created by Loyola Productions. It's actually a Jesuit film ministry. One of the things that you find when you work with the Jesuits is that they do everything, so including make movies. So some things about the lives of the Jesuits that are important to note, some things that sometimes surprise people. One, the Jesuits were, oftentimes when we start to talk about the time frame when they were killed, the 1980s, we've got the Cold War, we've got fears of communism in Central America, different people and perspectives from elements of politics that come into that. The Jesuits were not rebels out in the streets protesting. That's not the reason they were killed. The reason they were killed was because they were bringing truth to the reality of the situation in El Salvador. It was a reality of oppression. It was a reality of poverty, a reality of injustice. Into the 1980s, 90% of the wealth was controlled by 10% of the people of El Salvador. It was a tremendously unjust situation for the people, especially the economically poor, especially the rural economically poor. So they were working in their own fields to bring attention to that. So as we look around kind of the circle, Armando Lopez, he was a theology and philosophy professor. teaching at the university. Juan Ramon Moreno, he was in charge of an Ignatian Spirituality Institute at the university, trying to help people, and at the retreat center as well, trying to help people understand their faith, their Catholic faith. Segundo Montes was in charge of a Human Rights Institute. He was a sociologist. He actually testified in a U.S. congressional hearing during the 1980s about the situation of Salvadorans. Let's see, who else is up there? Joaquin Lopez y Lopez was the founder of the Salvadoran Fe y Alegría School Network. This was a Jesuit, still is, a Jesuit schools network that serves the most economically poor in rural areas of the country. So he was an educator. Martin Barreau was a psychologist. He was specifically studying the impacts of war and violence on people's lives, and what were the ramifications for people's psychological state from the violence that existed in El Salvador. Ignacio Echeverria was the president of the university. He was a philosopher by trade. He was a deep thinker. If you pick up an Echeverria book today, you need to take a cup of coffee and like a good commitment to try to internalize all of it. I mean, he was a very deep thinker. He focused on the integrations of philosophical thought and theology, Christian theology, and he was really trying to bring that to how he carried out the leadership of the University of Central America. So these were men that were working, they took their passions in their fields, and they really tried to find ways to integrate them with the reality of what was going on in El Salvador. Okay? Elba was the housekeeper. She had worked for the Jesuits for many years. She was staying at the residence because the situation in San Salvador at that time was very dangerous, and so the Jesuits had invited her to come stay in the residence in a guest room down the hall. And Selena, her 15-year-old daughter, had come as well. Elba's husband, Selena's father, had chosen not to come stay in the residence. He was invited. He chose to stay across the street. He was the first person to find the bodies of the Jesuits and the women the next morning. If you ever see images of the crime scene photos of Elba and Selena, you'll see that Elba was holding on to, or almost looked like she was trying to hold on to Selena as they were murdered. It's a horrible thing to picture and things like that. One of the other ironic things is that by 1989, a lot of people thought things were really steadying out in El Salvador. The U.S. was providing over $1 million of funding to El Salvador, military funding a day, from about 1980 up until the Jesuits were murdered. This stopped after the Jesuits were murdered. But people thought here in the U.S. and in El Salvador that things were steadying out, the situation was getting calmer. So a lot of people were shocked to hear that they were killed in 1989. They said in 1986 or 1980 that wouldn't have surprised them, but this late in the game, they thought that things were steadying out. But there were many in the Salvadoran government. Keep in mind, these were 26 Salvadoran military soldiers. These were not rogue people that came in. 26 Salvadoran military soldiers, 19 of whom had received military training at one point in their career in the United States, who came into there. It was found later that U.S. military personnel were aware that the killings were going to take place, and there were many, and that there were many Salvadoran officers who had specific Salvadoran officers who had ordered the murders of the Jesuits at that time. The other thing that's ironic is that the UCA, where the Jesuit University was in basically what had become almost a military compound. And the irony is that after the Jesuits were killed, immediately the government said it was the guerrillas. It was the left-wing guerrillas that committed the murder, which was just bizarre to anyone who knew about the situation, because literally the whole area surrounding the UCA was fortified with military checkpoints. So this just bizarre and unbelievable story that it was someone other than the government who had done it was, shocking. So just a few pictures from our time there. This is a mural on the campus of the UCA, and you can see the presence of the Jesuits today still on the campus is very profound. You can't walk around campus without learning a bit about the Jesuit martyrs. I talked about the communities that the Jesuits were connected to. I visited and stayed with a family in Guajila. This is a woman, a leader of the community and of the Christian-based community in the town, kind of like Christian Life communities I know are here in Pittsburgh and many other places around the country. And she was telling us about how she had come to know some of the Jesuits who were killed in 1989 when we visited. This is so on the campus of the UCA, there is the current Jesuit residence, and right next to it is what is called the Romero Center, where there is a museum to the Jesuit martyrs. There is this room they call the poster room, where they have picture books of all the crime scene photos from the murders of the Jesuits, where you can page through and look, and you can see one of the gentlemen, this is a teacher from St. Ignatius in Cleveland, was looking through the book, one of the books. The images are just stunning. There is a wall. It's a little hard to see because of the lighting, but there's a wall much like our Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., but it's a wall of people who were innocent civilians who were murdered throughout the Civil War. 30,000 names are on this wall, and this is Bill Noe. He's a Jesuit who works at the Jesuit parish in Richmond, Virginia. He was looking at it and finding names. I think he found the name of Retiro Grande, the one Jesuit who was killed in 1977. In the chapel at the Jesuit residence, there are the tombs of the 6 Jesuits. Elba and Selena are not buried there at the request of their family. They were buried with other family members. But so this is right in the middle of campus. There's a chapel dedicated to the martyrs. Their tombs are right there. The museum is right there. So it is at the center of the life of this Jesuit university in El Salvador. It's very much a part of them. At the back of the university, or at the back of the chapel, are these images, and these are just a few of them. They're very powerful, very challenging images to look at, and the reason they were done, the Jesuits actually talked about, because the way it works is that where the priest would be standing, or someone up at the altar, is seeing these images throughout Mass. And they said that they did this as a reminder to all who would come to lead people in prayer in that chapel of what happened in El Salvador over that 10 to 12-year period. A reminder of the brutality of the attack against humanity and life and dignity, that they would never forget that. So they're very powerful images. This is the scene, you saw this in the video, but a scene of the bodies after the Jesuits were killed. And you can see them there on the ground. They brought 5 of the priests out and left their bodies out on the lawn. They actually, and they mutilated their bodies and left as kind of a statement of what would happen. And as I said, Elba's husband found the bodies there first. He was the first person to find them and to tell the Jesuits, the other Jesuits who were not killed, who were not living in that residence, what happened. This is what that looks like today. They've, as part of the transformation that happened after the murders, they've turned it into a rose garden. There are 8 rose bushes planted in that garden to symbolize the lives and loss of those Jesuits, and their names, and the lay women. Their names are on that plaque there. And it was very intentional to leave that kind of space as a space of solitude, a space of reflection. So if you visit if you go to El Salvador and you visit the UCA, you can have a chance to walk through there and kind of sit and be present to it. So there's much more about the story I could tell you, but I really would like to start to think about, okay, well, what else was going along with this, and where do we go with this? So the loss of the Jesuits was at a time for, the church in the world was going through a lot of changes over the course of, from when the Jesuits came to El Salvador in the late 1960s to 1989, significant changes in the church. Most notable, the church went through the Second Vatican Council, which had enormous changes for the lives of people of faith here in the United States, but across the world. At that time, Pedro Arrupe was becoming the leader of the Jesuits, the Superior General, or Father General as they call him. He challenged people affiliated with Jesuit institutions and people who were connected to the work of the Jesuits to think in very new and radical ways from the trajectory the Jesuits were on up until that time. If you hear kind of some of the common, what I call like the common Jesuit phrases that you see talked about a lot, the idea of men and women for others, the idea of a faith that does justice. These were all illuminated by Father Arrupe during his leadership of the Jesuits. He also had to lead the Jesuits through a time of great loss. They lost a number of people over that history, including the 6 Jesuits in 1989 and many others. So this was a very challenging time because there was so much going on in the world, and how are the Jesuits going to relate to the realities of the world, the realities of a changing society and things like that. He gave a talk called Men and Women for Others. Has anyone ever heard of that talk, Men and Women for Others? Well, it's great if you ever have a chance to read it. It was given in 1973 to alumni of Jesuit high schools in Europe. So it wasn't to Jesuits, it wasn't to priests or nuns or anything like that, it was to lay people, like all of you. And what he was trying to help them understand was this new trajectory that the Jesuits were on that would lead the Jesuit martyrs to commit themselves so much to the people of El Salvador, but also lead many other efforts within the church very broadly as well. The talk, titled Men and Women for Others, sometimes gets truncated a little bit, and I feel like it gets sold short. But what it was really trying to do was help people understand that the Jesuits and the church were inviting people into a life of service, but not just of service like kind of handouts to people or charity, but also to respond to systemic realities that exist in our world and to really think about how we can have a place. So he grounded his talk in a few ideas. One, a respect for all people, a commitment to not be overcome by privilege. So in other words, not to allow ourselves to see our own situation, which often can be very privileged, as something that we, to not let that take over our lives or shade our view of the rest of the world. And the most powerful statement, not just refusal, but counterattack toward injustice. So Arupe said, you can't just be like, yeah, injustice is bad. I don't like it. But you have to be willing to say, injustice is bad, injustice is wrong, it cuts at the dignity of human beings, and I want to try to find ways in my life with my skills, with my abilities, my passions, my faith, to respond to it. And so we really put out a challenge. And there was a lot of pushback, towards Arupe in the work of the Jesuits and the work of the church. Even, in El Salvador, there were people that thought the Jesuit martyrs were pushing too hard in their work for human rights and their academic work, and Ignacio Echeverria's work for peace, because that was one of the things that Father Echeverria was about. He was trying to be a peace broker in El Salvador, to bring these sparring parties together and find some way to end both violence, but also work towards a more just society where people could live peacefully. And that created a lot of tension. So anyway, I give you that context because I think it helps you understand why the Jesuits would end up in this situation where they would be murdered in 1989. Now, what can we learn from these 6 men and 2 lay women? And it's important to say that we learn not just from the Jesuits, because Selena and Elba, they represent the 70,000 innocent people who were killed in El Salvador, whose names are often, in some cases, are still not known. There are literally thousands of disappeared people that, their status is presumed lost, but still their bodies were never found, they never had funerals, and so Elba and Selena, they're an important part of this story. We can't forget them. Well, there's a few things that Echeverria specifically talked about. This idea, we've heard maybe this phrase as you've heard about Ignatian spirituality. I know Father Kevin O'Brien was here a while back talking about the Ignatian adventure. And oftentimes when we talk about Ignatian spirituality, we'll talk about the idea of finding God in all things. It's a beautiful image to think about where is the presence of God and God's love and, throughout our world, even in the most horrific, the most challenging situation. Well, Echeverria and the other Jesuits really felt that we can't just search. That search has to be a really intensive search, that we have to be willing to get into the muck, into the swamp of the world and really seek out the realities, seek out God. So you have to kind of, again, like Arupe said, step away from maybe your position of privilege or your position of comfort and be willing to do that, okay? And that might happen in your own city, in seeking out some of the realities that are very challenging in your own city, maybe around poverty or race or injustice, or it might happen in another part of the world, and coming to understand the situation of our brothers and sisters in another place in the world through, traveling there or through really becoming aware of what's going on, maybe opening up the newspaper, reading an article you wouldn't normally read. I don't know. Justice is core to the gospel message, and we can get this from parables like the Good Samaritan, But we also get it, I think, from what we just went through this past Holy Week and Easter, where, if we listen to the challenge and the suffering that Jesus faced, clearly there was a higher reason. He was not just doing this kind of to make himself feel good. He was doing this as a representation of God's love. And if God loves us that much, in each of us, then there's this call then to respond to that love through our interaction and commitment to our brothers and sisters. And then following Jesus means walking with people with this idea of dignity, life, and liberation. And that's what the Jesuits were really doing in El Salvador. They were trying to figure out, how do we bring not just dignity, not just a more fuller life where people are not living in dire poverty, where people are not facing violence and injustice every day, but also, how can we walk with them and working towards something better. And this was challenging. This was part of, the liberation theology movement that gets criticized and has been criticized. I think Pope Francis has brought a different light to liberation theology maybe than we've heard over time. But this idea that the Gospels are stories of liberation. They help us, remove the barriers that keep us from God's love and from loving others. And that's a real challenge in our world, for sure, because there's so many things that keep us from doing that. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the ways that people have responded over time to these learnings that we can take from Arupe to the story of the martyrs. Really quickly, some of the things that happened after 1989, it was a real wake-up call for people here in the United States especially, because as I said, folks thought that things were getting better there, that things were becoming less violent. And what it did was it made people aware that, one, that wasn't the case, two, that for U.S. citizens, that our government was integrally involved through military funding, through other kind of diplomatic efforts that we were doing that were inconsistent with who we really are as a country, through military training and the fact that, as I said, 19 of the 26 who were involved in the murders and a number of the officers who helped to make that order had received training here in the United States. And so Jesuits and others in the church started to bring attention to that, to our policies, to our training, to our funding, and to really say, what are we doing? Is this consistent with who we talk about being as a country? And even within the church, is this, are we comfortable as a church with how our brothers and sisters are being treated in another part of the world? So it was a real wake-up call, especially for Jesuit institutions. A few years later, in the early 2000s, the Jesuits made a new and bold commitment to integrating a commitment to justice into education, both higher ed and secondary education. This started with a talk by the new Jesuit leader after Father Rupe passed away, Father Kolvenbach, who gave a well-known speech at Santa Clara University to higher education leaders from across the world, talking about how can we integrate a commitment to justice into who we are as institutions. And this has kind of trickled into not just Jesuit institutions, but many Catholic universities and high schools across the country and across the world. It focused on this idea that, one, schools need to expose their, I don't like to use it, schools need to engage their students in the gritty realities of the world. And that has to happen not just through concepts, but through contact. So I know that, I think I heard that maybe some Bishop Canevin students were on a mission experience or immersion experience relatively recently. How important it is for those sorts of experiences to understand the realities of the world. We can read about them in a book. We can pull up a zillion websites that tell us about that. But when you go and spend time, you meet with someone, you maybe live in their community or stay with them in their house, go visit them, understand how they live, what their daily life is like, it really helps you to internalize and think about, wait a minute, how am I part of this? If we truly believe that we're all God's children, we're all brothers and sisters, is this how I want my brother? Is this how I want my sister to live? So it emphasized that, this talk really emphasized this idea contact is as valuable in concept. So it changed the way Jesuit institutions and a lot of other Catholic institutions looked at education. It was part of the birth of, the growth of service learning in Catholic, both secondary and higher ed, of immersion experiences, of study abroad programs in the developing world. Students had been studying in Europe for years and years and years, but now there are many study abroad programs in the developing world, especially in Central America and the Caribbean. So it really changed the outlook of Jesuit education. One of the other things that started to happen was, that was a precursor to my work at the Ignatian Solidarity Network, was the bringing together of people to really explore what it means to be part of this Ignatian spiritual approach to faith, approach to Christian Catholic faith, and how we integrate justice. And one of the ways this happened was at the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice, the program I mentioned. For over 17 years now, people have been gathering at this national conference, which all of you are welcome to join us at next year, to talk about what does it mean to be a person of faith who's committed to justice. And so this is one way that our organization over time responded to and things like that. So these are a few examples. Let me tell you a little bit more specifically, though, some of the things that, here's a couple more pictures. This is, as part of that gathering in Washington, D.C., we have an action component. So we don't just learn and network and talk. We also head to Capitol Hill and we talk with representatives and senators about important human rights issues. So this is Father Tom Smolich. He's the former president of the Jesuits national office in Washington, D.C., and he led folks in prayer right in front of the Capitol. He actually turned and we all held our hands up towards the Capitol. I don't know if it did any good, but we gave it a shot. And this is students with Senator Roy Blunt. These are students from St. Louis University High School in Missouri talking with Senator Blunt about comprehensive immigration reform and human rights in Central America. And we bring people together to experience speakers like Father Jim Martin and Jesuits and lay people from around the world and things like that to help them understand issues of injustice. I want to really quickly talk about some work that we're doing on one issue that I think is really a response to the realities of our own country. We've made a significant commitment to working on the issue of comprehensive immigration reform. It's a really hard issue because there's a lot of different perspectives on it. It challenges often a lot of our beliefs about what we are, what we want to be as a country. It's very political at times. But this is an issue that for our work, for the work of the church, I mean, it's not unusual to hear bishops and other church leaders speak very passionately about this issue. And we're part of the U.S. Bishops' Conference as well as the National Jesuits teams that work on this issue on a regular basis. So I want to tell you a little bit about why we do this. And, the Jesuits in El Salvador, the Martyrs, were really good at analyzing what in kind of usually Ignatian words we call the signs of the times. The realities, what was happening in a particular place in a particular time, kind of taking a snapshot and saying, what's going on here? How are we part of it? How can we respond? It's a discernment process that needs to happen on a regular basis. It should incorporate prayer. It should incorporate analysis. For us, one of those issues is immigration. Our country's immigration policies, the realities of people's lives in Central America especially, and really thinking about this. Maria Ibarra is a graduate of the University of Detroit Mercy. It's the Jesuit University in Detroit. And she came to the U.S. When she was 7 years old. She was brought by her parents from Mexico, and she was brought into the United States without documentation. And so I want to share Maria's story really briefly. She talks about kind of what her situation is like. And the reason I want to share this story, because I really believe that in work for justice, stories are so important. And maybe you've found this in your own experience when you've volunteered somewhere, maybe a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter or a nursing home. How much you learn when you take time to stop and listen to what people, what their situation is, when you understand why they've come to be at that shelter, or why they are feeling so lonely, or why they're struggling so much. That stories, our faith is a relational faith. It's a faith that is grounded in listening and understanding the experience of another. Even if you think about Jesus' response to the leper or the sick. You know, it was about coming to understand. He didn't kind of commit or perform a miracle from afar. He went to be with people. So I'd like to share Maria's story with you. I think it's really it's powerful.
At the Ignatian Family Teach-In, I spoke about a dream, my dream. The dreams of 65,000 undocumented students who graduate from high school every year and are forced into the realization that the American dream that they have heard about for years does not belong to them, simply because they are undocumented, because they were brought to the U.S. by their parents as children. Their story is my story. My mom brought me to the U.S. when I was 9 years old. It was a decision I did not understand and could not control. In the U.S., life was better, easier. For the first time in over 3 years, my whole family was together again. We didn't have to worry about moving around all the time or simply just trying to make a buy. Michigan became my new home. I learned English the way any kid would. I watched cartoons. I never felt different from any other kids. I am proud to know the national anthem, and my answer to "Where are you from?" is always Detroit. I feel American, but I am not. According to dozens of politicians, living my 13 of 22 years in the U.S. does not qualify me as American. Not knowing anything else besides my life back home in Mexico is not enough. And certainly, graduating from an American high school and working my way through the University of Detroit Mercy and graduating as valedictorian is not enough. Because even though I feel American, I have a dark secret. My parents have always told me not to share my secret identity with anyone. Who knows what could happen if anyone were to find out? So 5 years ago, while all my friends were applying to the college of their dreams and making plans to move out, I secretly questioned if college at all would be possible. In most states, like Michigan, undocumented students cannot get financial aid, and many schools will not even accept us. The college of my dreams told me to fix my status and then we would talk. The admissions counselor literally took back the scholarship packet from my hands and closed the doors to my hope of a college degree. Thankfully, my parents are very pushy and very helpful. They motivated me to keep researching, and that's how I ended up at the University of Detroit Mercy. But it wasn't easy. Each year brought a whole new challenge. The question of not knowing if I would be able to afford another year of tuition sunk in at the end of every semester. What was especially difficult was hiding all of this from everybody I knew. But during the middle of my sophomore year, I was invited to be part of an immigrant rights group, focusing particularly on the DREAM Act, a legislation that has been around for over 10 years that would grant students who graduate from high school a chance to fix their status if they go to college or the military. For the first time in over a decade, I felt free to talk about how hard it was to live a double life, and how much it hurt to be viewed as a criminal, to live in fear.
That's Maria's story. And, you know, the thing about stories is that they help us understand someone's reality. It doesn't necessarily mean that we, change our views, but it opens us up to a new perspective on the world when we listen to someone's story. The thing about Maria that she doesn't tell you, because she's very humble, is she didn't just graduate from the University of Detroit Mercy. She ended up being valedictorian of her class. And so, the value of her contributions she can make to our country, to our society, thinking very pragmatically, to our economy, are significant. And she's, because of the current deferred action status that exists, she's actually working for the Jesuit Volunteer Corps right now, so helping others to serve as well. So it offers a unique story, and if you listen at the end, she talks about this sense of freedom, this idea of liberation, something that we learned from the Martyrs that was so important to help people not just have, life or dignity, but a sense that that there is hope in their situation and how important that is. So we work a lot on this issue. We work with partners all over the country, including on the U.S.-Mexico border, all the way to folks who do policy work on immigration in Washington, D.C. And the reason we do this is to be a conduit, a place that people can come to, where our work is grounded in faith and in Ignatian spirituality, and offer them ways that they can be engaged, they can learn more about this issue from people like Maria, but also ways that they can be involved in taking action. So to put their faith moving forward into action in some way as an advocate or as a supporter of people in a situation similar to Maria's in their own community. And the reality is that everywhere there are people facing the challenges of our immigration reality, regardless of your take on it. There are people who are suffering and who are struggling. Over 11 million undocumented people here in the United States. So it's an issue that we can respond to. Kind of thinking about why people come from Central America. So why did Maria's family come from Mexico? We've been doing a lot of work to bring attention to the human rights situation in Central America. We recently helped put out a 18-minute documentary about the situation in Honduras, a situation with great violence. It's called La Voz del Pueblo, the voice of the people. And it features this gentleman here. Padre Melo is a Jesuit priest in Honduras who runs a radio station, a human rights radio station. And it features their story, what it is like reporting on the human rights situation in Honduras and the dangers that they face. So it's a really interesting perspective. I think if you've ever said, well, but why are people coming here? Like, why do they want to leave their home? It's a great thing that you can watch to understand a bit about that. We're also trying to think about ways that we can support people's kind of efforts to liberate themselves from poverty and injustice. One of the major struggles that we see for institutions, for high schools and universities, is they want to do good things. They want to make just ethical choices. And one of these areas is what they buy, okay? Schools are often contacting us and say, we'd love to buy this or that, especially t-shirts, clothing. You know, we're buying new t-shirts for our team. We're buying new sweatshirts for the Glee Club, whatever it is, right? And they want to find ways to do that in a just way. So we have partnered with Altagracia. Altagracia is a living wage apparel factory. It's the only factory of its kind in the global South that offers workers a living wage, an opportunity to self-organize and participate in a labor union, and guaranteed health and safety standards. And what's really unique about this factory, beyond the fact that it's the only one of its kind, is that there are 2 faculty members at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business that have been doing extensive studies on both the business side of this, but the social impact side. So what impact is a living wage factory, a factory that pays 3 times the minimum wage in the Dominican Republic having for people? But also, how does this sort of model sustain itself? What is the role of an independent organization to verify that these standards are met and things like that? And so it's a really unique opportunity to educate people about the consumer choices that we make and how we might do them in ways that respond to the realities of our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. And so we're trying to bring attention to this, not just for institutions, but also we've had a lot of conversations with people who own businesses and are involved with civic organizations and things like that who are really interested in thinking about how they can support this very unique initiative. And I've been involved with this particular kind of movement of living wage apparel for many years, and I've actually seen 3 of these efforts fail. And so I'm really hopeful that this can work. And they failed not because they failed for real reasons, but there's a lot of reasons this one is succeeding right now. So anyway, I want to just kind of close. Certainly Pope Francis, when we talk about contemporary looks at how we can respond to realities of our world, when we talk about how we can live out a faith that does justice, when we talk about living out the legacy of the martyrs, Pope Francis has been a great witness for us. A couple of things that I'll tell you about Pope Francis. One, related to El Salvador, Pope Francis has brought the sainthood kind of path for Oscar Romero, the slain archbishop killed in 1980, to the forefront of kind of church politics. Next month, Archbishop Romero will be beatified, so he'll become blessed. Pope Francis validated his status as a martyr of the church. And so, he's really trying to, obviously, in many of his choices in new cardinals, he's really tried to bring attention to the perspectives of the global South in our church. And that's a place where our church is growing. And so there's something really great about that. So I'd encourage you to listen to what Pope Francis is doing in that area. Secondly, Pope Francis, like the martyrs, is a person who, when he talks about an issue. He talks about it in injustice. He does it in a way that doesn't just kind of put it in print and put it aside. When he talked about the reality of refugees, he went to Lampedusa in Italy, a place where hundreds and thousands, really, of refugees are coming from Africa. And he went there to be with them, to meet with them. When he's talked about injustice and the corporal works of mercy and serving our brothers and sisters, he's gone, like on Holy Thursday, he went to a prison to wash the feet of men and women. So he's really put himself not just to say great things, but also to lead by example. And I love this picture. I think you've probably seen this picture different places, but of being out in the rain, spending time shaking hands and talking with people, and just a great commitment to recognizing that our faith is very much a relational faith, and yes, we need times for solitude, we need times for private prayer and silence on our own, but our faith also calls us to be in relationship with others and to understand our brothers and sisters' reality. And so I think this quote, this idea of solidarity, and he points out that the term sometimes gets abused or misused or given a hard time, but the idea of community and of that we think beyond ourselves, and that's really what the martyrs were calling people within the church, within El Salvador, to do, was to think beyond their own wealth, their own power, and to be open to a society that would work more justly and would respond to the needs of more people. So it's a great challenge. It's a challenging challenge for sure.